It was almost midnight. I was sitting in my kitchen with a glass of water when I heard a sound from the direction of the fence. I went outside. Zoe was climbing over, one leg already in my yard, the other still on her side, her hair loose, her eyes fixed on the street. When she saw me, she didn't say anything for a second. Then she whispered, "Don't turn the lights on." I didn't ask any questions. I stepped aside and let her in. And that was the night I understood that my neighbor wasn't just someone who happened to live next door. My name is Owen Marsh. I'm 30 years old, and I work as a software engineer, fully remote, for a company based out of Austin, while I sit here in Memphis, Tennessee, in a house I bought mostly because it let me be left alone. 2 monitors, a coffee maker that runs most of the day, and a job that doesn't require me to leave the house except when I actually want to. It's not a glamorous life. I like the control of it, though, especially after a 4-year relationship ended on an ordinary afternoon with no warning attached to it, 18 months before any of this started. There wasn't a dramatic fight. There wasn't a single moment I could point back to. We just stopped being the 2 people who'd started that relationship. And one day, she said so out loud, sitting across from me at our own kitchen table on a Tuesday like it was any other evening. And that was that. I didn't fight it. I remember that surprising people more than it surprised me. There wasn't anything left to fight for by that point, just 2 adults quietly admitting what had already happened, months before either of us said it out loud. I packed up my half of a shared apartment over one weekend, found a short-term rental, and spent the better part of a year just working, sleeping, and trying not to think too hard about the shape of my life without someone else's routines running alongside mine. Friends kept asking if I was doing okay in that particular tone people use when they expect the answer to be no. And I kept telling them the truth, which was that I was mostly just quiet, not devastated, and that the 2 things aren't always the same. I bought the house on Sycamore Lane not long after, mostly because it was small, quiet, and had a backyard just large enough for a few tomato plants nobody was going to judge me for neglecting. It's a single-story brick place, nothing special to look at, but it had good light in the kitchen and a driveway wide enough for my truck. And something about walking through it the first time made me feel like I could actually start over inside it rather than just occupy the space. The real estate agent had called it cozy, which is realtor code for small, but I liked that about it too. Nothing in that house demanded more of me than I had to give at the time. The neighbors on the other side kept to themselves, which suited me fine. I wasn't looking to build anything with anyone. I was looking for a place where nothing much would be asked of me, where I could exist quietly behind a laptop screen and not think too hard about the parts of my life that felt unfinished. Then, 4 months before the night I just described, somebody new moved in next door. I was out watering the garden when I heard the sound of cardboard boxes being flattened on the other side of the fence. I looked over and saw a woman unloading an unreasonable number of houseplants and one strange-looking desk lamp that clearly hadn't found its place yet, along with the standard chaos of moving day. Furniture wrapped in blankets, a mattress leaning against the porch railing, a mover shouting something about which door led to the kitchen. Zoe Callahan, I'd learn, a freelance interior designer, working out of her own house, same as me. We traded names, traded jobs, and when I found out she also worked from home, I said without thinking much of it, "Welcome to the club." She laughed, short but real, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her, and I went back to watering my tomatoes without giving the moment any further weight. I found out later, through pieces of conversation over the following weeks, that Zoe had just come out of a relationship that had lasted the better part of 2 years, and that Memphis was, in her words, as far as I could get without actually leaving the state. I didn't press for more detail than that. I understood, from my own recent history, that some things get explained on their own schedule, when a person's ready to hand them over, and not a moment before. I recognized something of my own experience in the careful, guarded way she talked about it. The same instinct I'd had after my own relationship ended, to say just enough to satisfy politeness and no more, to keep the harder parts folded up somewhere private until I trusted the person asking. It's a strange kind of recognition, seeing your own defense mechanisms reflected back at you in someone else's careful phrasing. And I think, looking back, that recognition was part of what drew me toward her in the first place, long before either of us called it anything. There's a small solar garden light staked into the ground right along the fence between our 2 yards. I put it there the day I moved in, for a purely practical reason, so I could see the path to the back gate if I ever needed to step outside after dark, mostly to check on the grill or take out the trash without tripping over a garden hose I never quite got around to coiling properly. It runs on its own schedule, glowing faint gold once the sun goes down, switching itself off automatically once morning light hits the panel, an entirely self-sufficient little machine that never once asked anything of me beyond the 30 seconds it took to stake it into the ground. I didn't think much about that little light for the first few months. I didn't notice, not at first, that Zoe had started sitting near the window that faced that exact direction most evenings while she worked, and that the small glow from that light was the only thing lit between our 2 houses after dark. The first couple of weeks were what you'd expect from new neighbors: a wave in the morning, an occasional question about trash pickup days, nothing more than that. I didn't go looking for reasons to walk over and talk to her. I didn't feel any particular need to. I was still, if I'm honest, more comfortable with the version of my life where the fence stayed a fence and not much crossed it in either direction. But on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week, Zoe knocked on my door. Her Wi-Fi had gone out, and she had a deadline she couldn't afford to miss. A rendering package due to a client by 5 o'clock. Her whole morning's work sitting useless on a laptop with no connection. I fixed it in about 15 minutes. A router that needed resetting. Nothing complicated. The kind of small competence that felt almost embarrassing to be thanked for. She stayed and talked for another 45 minutes after that anyway, sitting at my kitchen counter, telling me about a client who wanted her entire living room redesigned around a couch that, according to Zoe, should have been retired a decade ago. I found myself laughing more in those 45 minutes than I had in the previous few months combined, though I didn't think much of that at the time either. I didn't set out to get close to a neighbor, I remember thinking, more than once over those following weeks. I bought that house specifically because it didn't require me to get close to anyone, but some things don't ask permission before they happen. I've come to believe that's true of most meaningful things in life. They rarely announce themselves with any warning. They just accumulate quietly, in the background, until one day you notice how much has changed without your explicit consent. To understand the night she climbed that fence, you have to go back through the 8 weeks that led up to it. Small, quiet moments that meant almost nothing on their own, but that, laid end to end, built into something I only recognized fully much later than I probably should have. In the 3rd week, not long after that first Wi-Fi visit, Zoe started knocking more often, sometimes with an actual reason, borrowing a tool, asking to use my printer because hers had stopped working, wanting a second opinion on paint swatches she'd taped up along her hallway wall. Sometimes without much of a reason at all, just a knock and a, "Hey, you busy?" that somehow always led to an hour of conversation neither of us seemed in a hurry to end. I started leaving my door slightly unlatched. left on the evenings I expected her to stop by, not really as a conscious habit, more because I noticed I'd started lifting my head off the screen every time I heard footsteps coming from that direction of the yard, a small anticipatory reflex I hadn't given myself permission to name yet. There was a Tuesday, I remember, when she showed up with a bag of takeout from a place a few miles away. No explanation offered beyond, "I got too much and figured you hadn't eaten." When we sat on my back porch eating out of paper containers, and she told me about growing up in a small town outside Nashville, about a father who'd built half the furniture in her childhood home himself, about how she'd fallen into interior design almost by accident after helping a friend stage an apartment for sale, and realizing halfway through that she actually had a talent for it. I told her about my own family, less colorful by comparison, and about the quiet satisfaction I found in solving problems nobody else could see the shape of until the code finally ran clean. Neither of us mentioned anything about our respective pasts beyond the surface of it. We were still, at that point, feeling out how much of ourselves we were willing to hand over. In the 5th week came our first dinner together. I'd made more chicken curry than I actually needed, telling myself it was simply a miscalculation on my part, doubling a recipe out of habit from cooking for 2 for so many years, and walked over to ask if she wanted some rather than let it go to waste. She came. We ate at my kitchen counter, and she told me about a midtown apartment renovation she was working on, the kind of project that clearly excited her. In a way most people don't get excited about their jobs. She talked with her hands, sketching shapes in the air to describe a built-in bookshelf she wanted to design around an awkward support beam. I listened the way you listen when you're genuinely curious, rather than just being polite, asking follow-up questions I didn't need to ask, wanting to know more than the conversation strictly required. When she left that night, she lingered at the door a beat longer than the goodbye called for, her hand resting on the frame like she hadn't quite decided the evening was over yet. I didn't register that at the time. I just said goodnight and went back to my laptop, already looking forward, without admitting it to myself, to whenever she'd knock again. In the 7th week, on a Saturday afternoon, Zoe sat out in her yard sketching something on a large pad of paper, and I went out to water my garden. Neither of us started a conversation. We just worked in the same general vicinity for close to 2 hours, glancing over occasionally, saying almost nothing. The kind of comfortable silence that only exists between two people who've stopped needing to fill every quiet moment with words. At one point, she held up her sketchpad without a word, showing me a rough drawing of my own backyard, the tomato plants, the fence, the small solar light rendered as a tiny glowing dot in the corner of the page. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said it looked good. And she smiled and went back to work like she hadn't just shown me something quietly significant. It was, without question, the most relaxed I'd felt in months. I told myself it was just a pleasant, quiet afternoon, the kind 2 easygoing neighbors might share without it meaning anything in particular. I didn't examine at the time why I kept finding excuses to stay out there longer than the garden actually required. 6 weeks before the night at the fence, I was working near my window on a Friday afternoon when I noticed a black SUV pull up in front of Zoe's house. The man sitting inside stayed there for about 15 minutes before he finally got out, the kind of good-looking that costs money to maintain, expensive haircut, expensive watch, the whole picture of someone used to being noticed. He knocked on Zoe's door. She didn't answer. The lights inside her house went dark, even though I knew she was home. I'd seen her car in the driveway not 20 minutes earlier. He stood there another 5 minutes before he finally left, glancing back at the house twice on his way to the car like he expected the door to open behind him. I turned back to my screen and didn't ask her about it the next day. It wasn't my business, I told myself, and that felt like a reasonable enough thing to believe at the time, though something about the whole scene sat uneasily with me for the rest of that afternoon. One evening, working later than usual, I looked out the window and caught the faint gold glow of that solar light, and then noticed Zoe sitting on the back steps of her own house, just a few feet from the fence line. She wasn't looking toward my window. She was just sitting there, arms wrapped around her knees, staring up at the sky, still as a photograph for the better part of 20 minutes. I watched for a moment and then turned back to my screen, thinking, she's probably just getting some air. What I didn't understand at the time, what only became clear to me much later, was that Zoe had found the one spot in her own house where she could sit close to me without needing a reason to knock on my door. That little patch of concrete steps was, in some quiet way I didn't yet have the vocabulary for, the closest she let herself get to me on the nights she didn't have an excuse ready. There was another evening, about 2 weeks before the fence, when I caught a glimpse of her through the gap between our two houses, standing at her own kitchen window with her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand pressed flat against her forehead, the way people do when they're trying to keep themselves calm during a difficult conversation. I couldn't hear anything, and I didn't try to. I just noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way she paced 2 steps one direction and 2 steps back, like a woman working hard to keep her voice from rising. At one point, she set the phone down on the counter without ending the call, pressed both hands flat against the surface, and stood there breathing for a long moment before picking it back up. I told myself it wasn't any of my business. I've thought about that evening a lot since, wondering whether that call had been with Derek, wondering what exactly she'd been holding together on the other side of that glass while I sat comfortably 50 feet away, doing nothing, entirely unaware of how close she already was to needing somewhere to run. Then came the night itself. It was nearly midnight, a Wednesday, and I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard the fence boards creak, the unmistakable sound of someone climbing over, wood straining under weight it wasn't built to handle. I went outside. Zoe was halfway across, one leg already planted in my yard, the other still balanced on the top rail on her side, her eyes locked on the street beyond her own front yard rather than on me. Her expression wasn't panic exactly. It was the look of someone who'd decided to act before the fear had a chance to catch up and stop her. The kind of controlled urgency you only see in people who've had to move fast before and learned how to keep their hands steady while doing it. When she finally noticed me, she whispered, "Don't turn the lights on." I followed her gaze. The black SUV was parked at the end of the street, headlights off, engine presumably still running, sitting there in the dark like it had every right to be. I didn't need her to explain anything further. I stepped aside so she could come the rest of the way over, catching her arm without thinking about it as she dropped down onto the grass on my side, and I closed the small back gate quietly behind her, the latch clicking softer than I'd ever managed to close it before. We sat in my kitchen with nothing but the refrigerator light on, both of us speaking in the kind of hushed voices you use in a room where you're not entirely sure who might be listening. Zoe explained briefly. Derek was out there. Not the first time. She didn't want him knowing exactly which house she was in, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of confirming she'd run somewhere specific, rather than simply hiding inside her own locked doors. I poured the tea. I didn't ask any more questions than that. I could see, even in that dim light, that her hands weren't entirely steady around the mug, and I understood, without her having to say it, that this wasn't the moment for me to press for a full explanation. Some nights call for company, not interrogation. She stayed until about 1 in the morning, the two of us talking in low voices about nothing important. Her work, my work. a documentary she'd half-watched the week before and never finished, filling the space between us with ordinary conversation, because ordinary conversation, I think, was exactly what she needed in that moment. A reminder that the world still contained things as unremarkable as unfinished documentaries and difficult clients, that everything hadn't collapsed down into just her and the SUV parked at the end of the street. At one point, she laughed at something I said, caught herself, glanced toward the window like she'd forgotten for a second she wasn't supposed to make noise, and then laughed again anyway, quieter this time, and something about that small moment of forgetting herself stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that night. When she finally left, I checked the street. The SUV was gone. I watched her cross her own yard and go inside, waiting until her door closed safely behind her before I went back in myself, standing at my own window a while longer than necessary, just to be sure. The following week, something between us had shifted, though nothing dramatic marked the change. Zoe stopped mentioning Derek entirely, and I didn't push, figuring she'd bring it up when and if she was ready to. But she started knocking in the evenings instead of the afternoons, sometimes just to sit on my couch with her laptop while I worked at my own desk a few feet away, both of us occupying the same room without needing to fill it with conversation. She started bringing coffee over when she noticed I was still working late, appearing at my door around 9 or 10 with 2 cups from the place down the street, never asking if I wanted company, just assuming, correctly, that I did. Small things I chalked up, at the time, to her simply wanting to say thank you in her own quiet way for that night at the fence. On Monday morning, I was getting the mail when I noticed a man leaning against a car parked in front of my house, dressed sharp, pressed shirt, the kind of confident smile people wear when they're used to controlling whatever space they've walked into. I recognized the SUV before I recognized the man, that same low, dark shape that had sat idling at the end of the street just a week earlier, headlights off, engine running, while Zoe scrambled over my fence in the dark. Something in my stomach tightened the moment I saw it, a reflex I didn't examine closely enough at the time to understand fully. "You're Owen, right? Zoe's neighbor?" I nodded. He stepped closer, close enough that I had to resist the urge to take a step back myself, an instinct I noted and chose not to act on. "I just wanted to say one thing, man. She does this, finds someone new to feel safe with whenever things get hard. It's not that she's trying to hurt anyone, but you should know where you actually stand in her story." I stayed quiet. Derek kept going, his tone level, almost friendly, as though he were explaining something obvious to someone who simply hadn't caught up yet. The kind of patient condescension that's harder to argue with than outright hostility would have been. "She climbed over your fence in the middle of the night. I know about it. I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at myself for letting things get to this point." He paused there, letting that sentence do its work. A flicker of something that almost looked like genuine regret crossing his face before it smoothed back into that same easy confidence. "But you understand, she's using you as a temporary landing spot. Once she's steady again, you'll know exactly where you fall in the order of things." Then came the line delivered gently, almost kindly, which somehow made it land harder than anything else he'd said. "I'm not telling you this to make things difficult. I'm telling you because I was standing exactly where you're standing once, before I was standing somewhere better." I didn't respond. I didn't have a response ready, not one that felt like it would land the way I wanted it to. And I've never been someone who does well arguing on the spot, always thinking of the right thing to say a full hour after the moment for saying it has already passed. Derek nodded politely, like the conversation had gone exactly the way he'd planned it, and walked back to his car, pulling away from the curb with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he'd already won whatever it was he thought he'd come to win. That afternoon, the woman across the street, Mrs. Whitmore, who spent most of her days at her front window with a cup of tea and an unmatched knowledge of everyone's business on the block, mentioned to Zoe that she'd seen a man talking to me that morning. Zoe listened, said nothing in response, and didn't knock on my door that evening, or the evening after that. 2 full days of quiet passed, longer than any stretch of silence between us since that first Wi-Fi visit. I didn't understand at first why Zoe had suddenly gone distant. I tried knocking once on the second evening, a flimsy excuse about returning a mixing bowl she'd left at my place weeks earlier. She answered, polite enough, thanked me for the bowl, but something had closed off behind her eyes that hadn't been there before, a wall I hadn't seen her put up in the 2 months I'd known her. I didn't have enough information to make sense of it. I just knew something had shifted, and I couldn't figure out what I'd done, running back through every recent conversation, every small interaction, looking for the moment I might have said the wrong thing, without realizing it. I even wondered, briefly and uncomfortably, whether Derek had somehow convinced her that I was the problem, that my presence next door was somehow complicating whatever peace she was trying to rebuild for herself. I sat in my house that evening, looking out at the little solar light still glowing beside the fence. It stayed lit whether anyone paid attention to it or not, indifferent to whatever silence had settled between the 2 houses it sat between. I remember pouring myself a drink I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands, and sitting at the kitchen table, replaying Derek's visit over and over, trying to figure out which parts of it had actually been about Zoe, and which parts had simply been about him wanting the last word in a conversation that was never really his to have. Derek wasn't wrong about everything. That was the hardest part to sit with afterward. The most dangerous sentence isn't always a lie. Sometimes it's a true sentence, delivered by the wrong person, at the wrong time, for the wrong reason entirely, wrapped around a real fear I hadn't yet admitted I was carrying myself, that I might just be a place for someone to land rather than someone worth staying with. It's an uncomfortable thing to have your own private insecurity handed back to you by someone with every reason to want you to believe it. 10 days after that quiet distance settled between us, I went out to my backyard on a Saturday afternoon and found Zoe sitting on her own back steps, in the same spot where she liked to sit late at night looking up at the sky, except this time in the honest light of a summer afternoon, no shadows to hide behind. We looked at each other across the fence for a moment before either of us said anything. "Do you want to talk?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, studying me like she was deciding how much of an answer I actually deserved. "About what?" "I don't know," I said. "But I know I did something or didn't do something and I can't figure out which, and I'd rather ask directly than keep guessing." Zoe didn't deny anything. She came closer to the fence, resting her forearms on the top rail, and told me, not every detail, just enough for me to understand the shape of it. Derek was the man she'd left, 8 months before she ever moved to Sycamore Lane, after a relationship that had started out feeling like devotion and slowly revealed itself to be something closer to ownership. He'd been the reason she stopped mentioning her old friends by name. He'd been the reason, she admitted, that she'd learned to make herself smaller in rooms where he was talking, to check his mood before deciding what she was allowed to want for dinner, to measure every sentence for how it might be received before she let herself say it. And for exactly the reason he'd demonstrated the day he showed up at my house, that particular gift for reframing anything true into something that made her look unstable. She hadn't wanted to explain any of it to me from the start, afraid I'd hear his version before I ever heard hers. "He has a gift," she said, for making the truth sound like an argument. He can take something completely real and hand it back to you sounding like a symptom of something wrong with me. I spent 2 years believing him more than I believed myself, and it took moving 3 states away to even start hearing my own voice again over his. I told her the thing I actually needed to say, not to defend myself, but because it felt like the right moment for it, and because staying quiet about it any longer felt like its own kind of dishonesty. The same kind of quiet avoidance I'd been guilty of at that barbecue months earlier, though this was a different neighborhood entirely, and a different kind of truth sitting on the table between us. I don't know what he told you, but I know that the night you climbed over that fence, I didn't ask you more questions because I didn't want to make you more afraid than you already were. Not because I didn't care. I cared more than I think I was supposed to, for a neighbor I'd known 2 months. Zoe looked at me for a long moment, something in her expression softening for the first time since that quiet had settled between us. I didn't climb into your yard just because Derek was out there. There are other houses I could have gone to. Mrs. Whitmore's even. She'd have let me in without a second thought. I climbed into yours. So that's it, I said. So that's it, she said back. And something about the plainness of that exchange felt more honest than anything either of us had said in the previous 10 days combined. More honest in some ways than anything either of us had said since the day we first met over a fence full of moving boxes. I looked down at the little solar light by the fence, still glowing faintly even though it was still daylight, quietly recharging for the evening ahead, the small mechanism inside it doing its quiet work regardless of anything happening around it. You know, I told her, I put that light there because I needed to see the path to the back gate at night. That's what I told myself anyway. And the real reason? I didn't answer right away. I looked at the light, then back at her, taking a moment to actually consider the question instead of brushing past it the way I might have a few weeks earlier. Then I said, I don't know anymore, but I think it doesn't need a reason beyond the fact that it was on. And it was enough for me to see your face that night. She didn't say anything else after that. She just reached over the fence and rested her hand briefly against mine. A small, unhurried gesture that told me everything the last 10 days of silence hadn't been able to say. Neither of us needed to make it bigger than that. We stood there a while longer, the afternoon sun starting to lean toward evening, the cicadas beginning their first hesitant notes somewhere in the trees behind her house, and for the first time since Derek had shown up at my mailbox, the quiet between us felt like the good kind again. The week after that conversation, nothing was made official between us in any formal sense. There was no conversation where either of us used the word relationship, no defining moment we could point back to later as the official start of anything. I just started cooking for 2 without needing a reason to explain it, buying groceries with an automatic assumption she'd be over at some point during the week. Zoe brought coffee over in the mornings when she noticed I was already at my desk, sometimes staying for 20 minutes, sometimes just handing it through the door and heading back to her own work. Neither of us called it anything. The solar light kept glowing every night, same as always, indifferent to whatever shape our 2 lives were slowly taking around it. Derek tried once more, this time not in person. A long message to Zoe's phone, carefully worded, trying to recreate some version of a memory he wanted her to feel nostalgic about, a trip they'd taken early in their relationship, a joke only the 2 of them would understand. The kind of message designed to pull at exactly the threads he knew best how to pull. She read it standing in her own kitchen, set the phone face down on the counter, and didn't reply. Instead, she walked over and knocked on my door. You busy? She asked. Nothing important, I said. I just didn't want to sit alone tonight. Then come sit here, I said. There was no fence to climb this time. She just walked through the gate. Tsun, the same gate that had once required her to scale a fence board in the dark, now standing open like it had always been meant to be used that way. We sat on my couch that night, not talking about Derek's message at all, just watching some show neither of us particularly cared about. Her feet tucked up beside her, my arm along the back of the couch behind her, without either of us commenting on it. It was, I remember thinking, the first time I'd stopped counting the days since that fence, stopped keeping some invisible tally of how careful we needed to be with each other, how much space to leave, how many questions were too many. We were just two people on a couch, tired from ordinary days, letting the evening settle around us without either of us performing anything for the other. One evening, not long after that, I bought a second solar light identical to the one already staked by the fence, driving to the hardware store on a whim during my lunch break, and I planted it on Zoe's side of the fence without saying a word about it, working quickly in the fading evening light before she got home from a client meeting downtown. The next morning, she stepped outside with her coffee and saw it standing there, glowing faintly even in the early daylight before its sensor had fully registered the sun. She looked across at my house. I was standing at my own back door with a cup of coffee, watching her, not pretending I hadn't been the one who put it there. She didn't say anything. She just nodded once, a small, private acknowledgement that needed no further explanation between the two of us. That was how okay got said between the two of us, without either of us needing to say the word out loud. It's summer again in Memphis now, 6 months since that night at the fence. The little gate between our 2 yards stays open most days, the hinges long since worn into a comfortable creak. Neither of us has bothered to fix, mostly because we've both grown fond of the sound it makes, a small signal that someone's crossing over. We still technically live in 2 separate houses, 2 separate mortgages, 2 separate mailing addresses, but the boundary between them stopped feeling real a long time ago. Half my kitchen drawers have things of hers in them now. Half her bookshelf has things of mine. Zoe still sits on her back steps most nights, looking up at the sky. Taisha, the same habit she had long before I ever understood what it meant. Now I usually walk over and sit beside her, on her side of the fence, instead of watching from my own window like I used to, without knowing what I was watching for. Sometimes we don't say anything at all, just sit there together while the cicadas work themselves up into their evening noise and the heat of the day finally starts to let go. 2 small solar lights glow together now, one planted on my side, one on hers, close enough to the fence line that from a distance, on the right kind of night, you almost can't tell where 1 yard ends and the other begins. One evening, sitting out there with her feet propped up on the step below mine, she asked me, "Do you ever think about what you did that night, when you didn't ask any more questions?" "I think about it a lot," I told her, and I meant it. It's the kind of memory that's grown larger rather than smaller with time, the way certain small decisions do once you understand everything that grew out of them. "That was the most right thing you ever did," she said, and there wasn't anything dramatic in the way she said it, just a plain fact, delivered the way you'd mention the weather, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd made a bigger moment out of it. I bought that house because I wanted quiet. No one knocking, nobody needing anything from me, nothing pulling at whatever schedule I'd built for myself in the wreckage of a relationship I still hadn't fully made sense of. I had exactly that, for about 3 months, before Zoe moved in next door, and, without either of us planning it, started dismantling that particular version of my life one small interruption at a time, and I've never once regretted losing that particular kind of quiet. Derek told me I was only a temporary landing spot. I'm not angry at him for saying it, not anymore, though I was for a while. He was right about one part of it. Zoe did need somewhere to land. What he got wrong was assuming that need made her weak, that a person reaching for stability after something painful is somehow less worth choosing rather than more. I think, if anything, the opposite turned out to be true. She knew exactly what she needed, and she knew exactly where to find it, long before I caught up to the same understanding. She didn't climb over that fence because she panicked. She climbed over it because she'd already decided, quietly, long before that night, that mine was the yard she could run to without needing to explain herself first. It just took me longer than it took her to understand that, and I've come to believe that's often how it works between two people. One of them arrives at the truth first and simply waits, patiently, for the other to catch up. I've thought, more than once, about how many other nights there might have been where she almost knocked and didn't, almost climbed and talked herself out of it, working up to that one Wednesday when the fear finally outweighed the hesitation. My grandfather used to say that some people build fences to keep things out, and some people build them just tall enough that anyone worth having in their life will still find a way over. I didn't build mine on purpose. I think, in the end, it worked out that way anyway. It's a strange thing to be grateful for a piece of ordinary wooden fencing, a $100 hardware store purchase installed by the previous owner years before I ever bought the place. But I find myself looking at it differently now, understanding that it became, for one crucial night, the exact height a person needed it to be in order to climb it. That little solar light is still staked in the ground by the fence, doing exactly what it's always done, quietly lighting a path nobody but the two of us fully understands the significance of. And now there's a second one right next to it, glowing in the same rhythm, switching on and off with the same sun. So let me ask you something. Have you ever stood close enough to someone, for long enough, that they knew they could climb over your fence at midnight, and you'd simply step aside and let them in, no questions asked? And if someone ever whispered, "Don't turn the lights on," would you have trusted them enough to listen, before you even knew why? If this story reminded you of someone, a person who knows they can knock on your door at any hour without hesitation, no explanation required, leave a comment and tell me about it. Like this video, if you believe that sometimes not asking for more is exactly the right way to show someone you care. And subscribe, because next week I've got another story about ordinary people and the moments that end up changing everything, right when nobody expects it to.